If you've ever been disbelieved when you were telling the absolute truth, if you've ever watched someone you love slip further away while the people who were supposed to help only saw you as a suspect, then stay with me for the next 40 minutes, because this story is going to sit with you long after it ends. And if it moves you even a little, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard by more than just us. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, and for the last 4 years, he had been both mother and father to his daughter, Ellie. His wife, Rachel, had died in a car accident when Ellie was only 6, and in the wreckage of that grief, Daniel had rebuilt an entire life out of habit and love. He worked the early shift at a hardware distribution warehouse so he could be home by 3 every afternoon, in time to pick Ellie up from school. He learned to braid hair from watching tutorial videos at 2 in the morning. He learned which stuffed animal had to sit on the left side of the pillow and which one absolutely could not touch the floor. He learned to be enough, even when enough felt impossible. Their apartment was small, in a quiet corner of a mid-sized town called Brookhaven, the kind of place where everyone waved at everyone and nothing much ever happened. Daniel liked it that way. After the accident, he didn't want excitement. He wanted routine, safety, and the sound of Ellie's laughter echoing through their tiny kitchen every morning while he made pancakes shaped like uneven stars, because he never quite got the pour right. Ellie was 10 now, sharp and funny in the way only children who've had to grow up a little too fast can be. She noticed things. She noticed when Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes, when he sat a little too long in Rachel's old armchair after Ellie had gone to bed, staring at nothing. She noticed, and in her own quiet way, she took care of him too. Their bond was the kind neighbors commented on, inseparable, tender, and fiercely loyal. Which was exactly why what happened next didn't make any sense to anyone who truly knew them. It began on an ordinary Thursday. Daniel picked Ellie up from school as always, and they stopped by the small corner store to buy milk and the cereal with the cartoon tiger on the box, the one Ellie insisted was scientifically the best breakfast food. They walked home together, Ellie chattering about a science project on volcanoes, Daniel nodding along, distracted only by the ordinary weight of an ordinary day. He made dinner. She did homework at the kitchen table while he cleaned up. At 8:30, he tucked her in, checked that the nightlight was on, and kissed her forehead. At 6 the next morning, her bed was empty. At first, Daniel thought she'd simply gotten up early, maybe wandered to the living room to watch cartoons the way she sometimes did on weekends, but the apartment was silent in a way that felt wrong, heavy, wrong in his bones before his mind even caught up. He called her name. He checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed, the small balcony where she sometimes sat with her stuffed rabbit to watch the sunrise. Nothing. No shoes missing from the rack. No jacket gone. Just an empty bed with the blanket pulled back, as if she'd simply dissolved into the morning air. He called the police at 6:14 a.m., his voice cracking so badly the dispatcher had to ask him to repeat his address 3 times. Within the hour, Brookhaven's modest police department had mobilized what resources it had. And that was when Detective Sarah Whitfield entered the story, a woman in her mid-40s with 15 years on the force, known for being thorough, skeptical, and utterly unsentimental about cases involving children, precisely because she'd seen too many that broke her heart in ways she'd stopped trying to explain to anyone outside the job. Sarah walked into that apartment expecting to find a distraught father. What she found, initially, unsettled her. Daniel wasn't screaming or sobbing uncontrollably the way she expected. He was eerily still, sitting on the edge of Ellie's bed, holding the stuffed rabbit that had been left behind, his eyes distant and hollow. Grief and shock can look like many things, Sarah knew that. But she also knew that guilt could wear that same quiet mask. And when she asked her first routine questions, "Where were you last night? Did anything unusual happen? Has Ellie run away before?" Daniel's answers came out clipped, disorganized, sometimes contradicting small details of timing that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed the beginning of a narrative Sarah had seen too many times before. There was no forced entry, no broken window, no disturbed lock. Whoever took Ellie, if she was taken at all, had either come in without needing to force anything, or she had left on her own. And in cases like this, statistics were cruel and blunt. The person closest to the child was almost always the first and most likely explanation. By that afternoon, whispers had already started circulating through Brookhaven. Neighbors who had once waved warmly at Daniel now watched him from behind curtains. The story spread the way stories do in small towns, reshaped a little with each retelling, growing teeth it never had. Someone remembered that Daniel had seemed distant a few weeks back. Someone else recalled an argument they thought they'd overheard through thin apartment walls, though they couldn't quite say when or about what. None of it was evidence. All of it became suspicion. Detective Whitfield brought Daniel in for questioning that evening, not yet as a suspect, she told him, just to get a clearer picture. He went willingly, desperately, believing that if he simply explained everything he knew, they would go out and find his daughter faster. He didn't yet understand that in the eyes of the law, his cooperation would be read alongside his inconsistencies, and that his devastation would be measured against a checklist designed to catch liars. The interrogation room was small, the overhead light too bright, the table between them cold and metal. Sarah sat across from him with a folder of notes, and for the first 20 minutes, she watched him more than she listened to him. She watched the way his hands shook when he described the pancakes he never got to make that Friday morning. She watched the way his voice broke on the word empty. And still, professionally, clinically, she noted the timeline gaps, the 20 unaccounted minutes between when a neighbor said they saw his kitchen light on and when he claimed he'd already gone to sleep. "I need you to walk me through last night again," Sarah said, "from the moment you tucked her in." Daniel did, for what felt to him like the 10th time, though it was only the 3rd. He described checking the nightlight, the sound of Ellie's breathing evening out into sleep, walking to the kitchen to wash the last of the dishes, watching part of a baseball game with the volume low so it wouldn't wake her, and going to bed himself around 11. "And you didn't hear anything? No sounds, no one at the door?" "No, nothing. I would have heard something. I sleep with my door open specifically so I can hear her." "Some neighbors reported your kitchen light was on until almost midnight." Daniel paused, genuinely searching his memory, and that pause, that natural human pause of trying to recall an unremarkable detail from an unremarkable night, was, to Sarah's trained eye, exactly the kind of hesitation that so often preceded a lie. I don't remember staying up that late. Maybe I left the light on by accident. I don't know." It wasn't a good answer. It wasn't a bad one either. It was simply the honest, imperfect answer of a man who hadn't been paying attention to his kitchen light because his entire world hadn't yet collapsed. Sarah leaned back, studying him. "Daniel, I have to ask you directly. Is there anything at all, that happened between you and Ellie that you haven't told me? An argument, a punishment, anything that got out of hand?" The question hit him like a slap. His head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharp with something between horror and fury. "You think I hurt my daughter? I think," Sarah said carefully, "that in cases like this, the person who loves a child the most and the person responsible for what happened to them are sometimes, tragically, the same person. I'm not accusing you. I'm asking you to help me rule things out." Daniel put his face in his hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sarah heard something crack in his composure. "I would burn the world down for her," he said, voice muffled. "I have spent 4 years being everything for that little girl because her mother isn't here to do it with me. I don't sleep some nights because I'm terrified I'm not enough for her. And you're sitting here asking me if I hurt her." It wasn't an admission. It wasn't quite a denial either, not in the sharp, clean way procedure preferred. It was simply pain, unfiltered and inconvenient for a room built to extract facts. The first 48 hours are the ones that matter most in any missing child case. And Brookhaven's small department did what it could, search parties combing the nearby woods and creek beds, officers canvassing every house on Daniel Street, flyers with Ellie's gap-toothed smile stapled to telephone poles and taped inside store windows. Daniel wasn't allowed to join the search parties. He was, for now, a person of interest, and his presence in the search would complicate things legally and, some suggested quietly, emotionally. So he sat. In his apartment, then in a hotel room, the department suggested he use so investigators could process his home more thoroughly, then back in the interrogation room for another round of questions on day 2, and again on day 3. Each session added another thread of suspicion, not because Daniel was lying, but because trauma does not organize itself neatly into a timeline. He remembered small, useless details with startling clarity, the exact cartoon on the cereal box, the specific shade of the nightlight glow, while entire stretches of ordinary time simply refused to reassemble themselves in order. By the 4th day, the story had reached the local news. A camera crew parked outside Daniel's building. A reporter used the phrase, "Father remains uncooperative with certain aspects of the investigation," which was not exactly a lie, but was also not the truth Daniel would have used to describe his own desperate, exhausted attempts to answer every question he was asked, over and over, until the words themselves stopped feeling real in his mouth. Detective Whitfield, to her credit, wasn't cruel. She wasn't building a case out of malice. She was doing what 15 years of experience had taught her to do. Separate feeling from fact, follow the statistics, distrust her own instinct to feel sorry for a grieving father, because sympathy had blinded good investigators before, in cases that ended in tragedy. But something about this case nagged at her in a way the others hadn't. Maybe it was the rabbit, the way Daniel had been holding it that first morning. Not like a man performing grief, but like a man clinging to the last physical trace of his child. Maybe it was the calluses on his hands from warehouse work, or the school drawings on the fridge with "World's Best Dad" written in a child's careful, uneven handwriting. Maybe it was simply that, in 15 years, she had learned to trust the parts of a case that refused to add up as much as the parts that did. On the 5th day, everything changed. A trucker stopped for gas 2 counties over noticed a young girl sitting alone at a diner counter, dressed in pajamas beneath an adult-sized coat that clearly wasn't hers, staring blankly at a menu she wasn't reading. Something about her stillness worried him enough to ask the waitress to call the local sheriff. Within 20 minutes, officers confirmed what the trucker suspected. It was Ellie. She was alive. Frightened, disoriented, dehydrated, but alive. When Sarah arrived at the hospital where Ellie was being checked over, she expected relief to simplify things. Instead, what Ellie told them, haltingly, through a child advocate specially trained for exactly these conversations, reshaped the entire case in a direction no one had considered. Ellie hadn't run away. She hadn't been taken by a stranger breaking through a window. She had been taken by someone Daniel trusted completely, his own younger brother, Marcus, who had been struggling for over a year with a gambling addiction and mounting debts he'd hidden from everyone, including Daniel. Marcus had a key to the apartment given to him years ago for emergencies, back when Daniel still believed his brother's worst days were behind him. That Thursday night, desperate and unraveling, Marcus had let himself in quietly while Daniel slept, woken Ellie gently, telling her their father needed her to come with him for a surprise. A lie a frightened, half-asleep 10-year-old had no reason yet to question. Marcus's plan, as it unraveled to investigators over the following days, had been reckless and half-formed even by his own admission. Some confused, desperate idea about using Ellie as leverage with people he owed money to, though it fell apart almost immediately once he realized the magnitude of what he'd done. Panic took over. He drove aimlessly for days, staying in cheap motels, buying Ellie food from vending machines, promising her they'd go home soon, growing more erratic with every passing hour, until finally, exhausted and out of options, he'd left her at that diner while he tried to figure out what to do next, and never came back. When Sarah heard this, sitting in a quiet hospital hallway with the case file open on her lap, something in her chest went cold, and then, slowly, ashamed. Every gap in Daniel's timeline, every trembling inconsistency, every moment she had read as suspicious had simply been a father in shock, telling the truth as best a shattered mind could manage. The kitchen light left on, the baseball game half remembered. None of it had ever been evasion. It had been grief, plain and unglamorous, mistaken for guilt because grief so rarely performs itself the way procedure expects. She found Daniel in the hospital waiting room, still in the same gray hoodie he'd been wearing for what she now realized must have been days, unable to bring himself to leave in case there was news. When she told him Ellie had been found, alive, safe, asking for him by name, Daniel didn't celebrate. He simply folded forward, silent, his shoulders shaking with a kind of relief too large for sound. "I need to say something to you," Sarah said quietly, sitting beside him rather than across from him this time. "I spent 5 days treating you like a suspect instead of a father who was drowning. I let statistics tell me who you were before I let myself actually listen. I'm sorry." Daniel looked up at her, eyes raw and exhausted. "You were doing your job." "I was doing my job badly," Sarah said. "There's a difference between being thorough and refusing to see what's right in front of you. I should have seen it sooner." He didn't have the energy for bitterness. Not with Ellie just down the hall, sleeping under hospital blankets with a nurse checking on her every 20 minutes. But he did say one thing, quietly, that Sarah carried with her long after the case closed. "Just next time. Next time someone like me is sitting in that room, falling apart because their kid is missing, maybe look a little harder before deciding it's their fault." Ellie's reunion with Daniel happened in a small hospital room with pale green walls, and there are moments too tender for any camera to properly capture, though several nurses on shift that day would later say they'd never seen a hug quite like it. The kind where it seems like two people are trying to fold an entire absence back into nothing through sheer force of holding on. Marcus was found 3 days later, turning himself in at a police station 2 states away, hollowed out by guilt and addiction in equal measure. His case moved through the courts separately, a long and complicated road involving mandated treatment as much as consequence, one that Daniel, remarkably, chose not to poison with hatred, even as he set clear, permanent boundaries around his daughter's safety going forward. Forgiveness, he would later say, wasn't something he offered easily or completely, but he refused to let bitterness take up space in the home he was rebuilding with Ellie. Detective Sarah Whitfield requested a formal review of how the investigation had been handled in its early days, not to protect herself, but to push for changes in how grieving parents were treated during the earliest, most fragile hours of a case. Changes that eventually influenced training protocols in departments beyond just Brookhaven. She and Daniel didn't become close friends exactly, but something like mutual respect passed between them whenever their paths crossed afterward, an unspoken acknowledgement of a mistake made and, eventually, corrected. 6 months later, Ellie was back in school. Back to talking too much about volcanoes, back to insisting the tiger cereal was scientifically superior. The nightmares came less often now. And when they did, Daniel was there, same as always, sitting on the edge of her bed until her breathing evened back out into sleep. The pancakes were still uneven stars. The apartment still smelled like coffee and crayons. Some things, thankfully, had simply gone back to being ordinary. But something had shifted too, quietly, in the way Daniel carried himself. He no longer flinched at the sight of a police car slowing near their street. He had, somehow, without ever wanting the lesson, learned that being disbelieved does not make a truth any less true, and that the people who eventually choose to listen, really listen, can still make all the difference, even if it comes later than it should have. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, let it be this. Don't assume you understand someone's pain just because it doesn't look the way you expected it to. Grief has no script. Love, especially the fierce, unglamorous, everyday love of a single parent, doesn't always announce itself in ways that are easy to recognize. Sometimes the truth is sitting right in front of you, trembling, exhausted, telling you everything it can, and all it needs is someone willing to finally believe it. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it touched you, please consider subscribing for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that love, even quiet and imperfect love, is always worth believing in.